I am going to be doing a quick screencast on the steps required for the HOTS and BATS lab. So you've all been sent the HOTS and BATS lab, and you've read number 1, which means you've gone around and looked through the Hawaii Ocean Time series, as well as looking at BATS, which I'm sure you've looked at. This is going to be specifically starting with step number 2, and all of this is found on this data sheet, which has been sent to you. To start, we go to data extraction, which is here, and click on bottle. From bottle, you're going to make sure you're on the Aloha station. It doesn't always pop up to that one. I'm going to pick my own birth month. You're going to pick the birth month, which starts with the day. I'm going to pick the same year you guys are in. Most of you are in 2001. We're going to look for a whole month at a time because that gives us the greatest chance of finding the data we need. Make sure the starting depth is 0, at least 5,000. The values we're going to be looking at, since we're doing a temperature and salinity depth profile, will be salinity and temp for CTD. And we want the output type to be text. When you do that, it will come back with, this is called comma separated values, and this is all the data we need in a format that's, we have to convert to a format that Excel can use. So to select it, I'm going to hit the command button and A, that selects all, and then I'm going to click command and C to copy it. In Excel, I'm going to go to my first cell, which is A1, and do command and V to paste. While you're going through this video, remember you can pause, so if I'm going too fast or you want to work in real time, just pause where I'm at and you guys can work on that. I actually don't need this data set anymore, so I'm going to shrink this whole website and be working in Excel. I've already named my file. You should do that. Since there's already now data in here, I'm going to save. You should take a moment and do the same. With this whole column selected, we now, you'll see that there's something in A, A2, so on. And if you were to click on D, even though these numbers come across, see in the formula bar up here, it's actually blank. These are all in here, and we have to tell Excel that these numbers with the commas, that's our data set. So I'm going to select the whole column by clicking on the A. I'm going to go to Data, Text to Columns, and pay careful attention to this part. We're doing delimited. That means that there's a character that separates. There are 2 characters that separate. Mine are already clicked off. You'll probably have to check them on yours. We have a tab and a comma. I'm going to click Next again. Because one of them is date, I actually want it to go in as date format. I'm just going to show you to do that. I clicked on the date area in the data preview. Then I click month, day, year, which is what format we're at, and then finish. And it moves it all into the data sheet. One of the things I want you to look at is basically the idea behind this data set out is that this oceanographic group went out and they used the CTD just like we do, and they did casts. So these casts mean that they dropped the CTD in the water. It actually has a big cage around it, and they lowered it. So that's what this is. This stands for depth, which I'm going to change right now. And they lowered it through the water column. You can see it started out 4.5 meters, down and down and down until they got to 4,800 meters. They took temperature the whole way, and they took salinity. Notice here, the salinity values are bad, -9. You can't have a negative salinity. So one of the things to be aware of is you're working in a raw data set. And when this happens sometimes the values are bad. Right now I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to label each column what it should be labeled. This one should be temperature. Oops. Always include units here. Oh, shift option 8. To get the degrees in Celsius is shift option 8. Salinity. I'm going to use PSU here. The reason why we always put the units in the header bars is if you were to put a unit after this, okay. Notice that all the numbers are aligned to the right. That's a sign that Excel recognizes this as a number. So if you were to have to manipulate the data, find the average, graph this, it could. Where I put the unit in afterwards, it doesn't see this as a number anymore. That's why it's shifted to the left. So we're going to take that out of there. You want to only have numbers in your cells. Now that you're looking at this, we can get rid of bottle ID. We don't need that. To delete an entire column, you do Edit, Delete, and it should get rid of the whole column. We also don't need time, so I'm going to show you a trick. So we highlight this column again. Instead of having to do edit delete again, I can just do the command button and Y, and it repeats the command. That'll be a useful thing to know for when you're working later on your own data sets. Then we have to find a single cast where they cast the CTD over to the side that goes from a depth of the surface all the way down to at least 4,000 meters. This one would be great, except the data is corrupt, so we can't use this one. This one only goes to 1,000, so we're not going to be using this one. I'm going to keep scrolling till I find one that goes to 4,000. This one looks promising. So this has data all the way down. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select all of the data below this. And I'm going to delete it. Edit. Delete. It's going to ask me, I'm going to shift cells up. That's an important thing to do when you're working in a data set. I also don't need any of the data above it, so I'm going to do the same thing again. Select all of this. Command Y. Now I just have one single cast of data from the surface all the way down. Oh, you know what else I don't need? I don't need this whole column, this whole row. And so now I just have depth, temperature, and salinity. So now it's time to graph. My first graph, I want to do depth versus temperature, so I'm going to select just that data. Notice I didn't select the headers. In the charts pane right here, I'm going to select scatter, smooth line scatter, and that gives me a graph. This graph, and by the way, Excel always calls graphs charts, so I'll go back and forth, but there really should be called graphs, is as an object in the page. In order to move this into its own page so that we can really manipulate it, we have to move it. To do that, I'm doing Control-click, which is the equivalent of right-click. See right here where it says Move Chart? I'm going to select that. And we always want it as a new sheet. You should also get in the habit of naming things as you move them. So I'm going to name this HOTS, because that's our data set, and then Graph. While I'm at it, I'm also going to name this sheet. I'm going to rename it HOTS Data, because eventually you'll have your BATS data in here too. So now I have two sheets. Since I've gotten quite a bit done, I'm going to save. Hit continue. In this graph, as you probably noticed, it doesn't look like our temperature salinity graphs we've drawn. As a matter of fact, what should jump out at you right away is, for some reason, depth is on the X, and the temperature is on the Y. So we're going to change that. In order to do that, we go to Chart, Source Data. While I'm in here, see how it says Name? I can actually name this. Since I'm going to be doing temperature versus depth, I'm going to name right here. I can select a single graph. So I'm clicking on the empty space, closing this for a second, clicking on the cell, and then opening that back up. And you'll see in here it's going to use that cell as the name for the series. In addition, you can see that you have your X data here and your Y data here. There's two ways to change this. One of the ways, the very simple ways, if I know that I want the temperature along the X, I can close this and just select here. Open this back up, and it's changed it to those values, and I can change Y the same way as well, so that now it's depth. When I click OK, it's actually flipped these. I'm going to show you another way to do it too. I did Control-Z there. Control-Z will always undo whatever you want to do. The other way to change it that's pretty easy, and when you're working with a really large data set where you don't want to select everything, Chart, Source Data. See how this is labeled? So what this is a formula for selecting, and I can change this. So this says $B $. That means it's fixed. If I change this to a C and change this one to column C, it's now selecting temperature instead of depth. And I'm going to change the C's here to B's. When you're working with a very large data set, sometimes it's easier to move it that way. I'm going to go back here, make sure we use the right name, click OK, and it's flipped. This sort of brings you to the point there's frequently more than one way to do something in Excel. In our temperature depth profiles, we always had 0 at the top. So to do this, we're going to click on the axis. I know that the axis is highlighted because there's a box around it. Then I'm going to double click it. Additionally, when you go into this, it says Format Axis. I'm going to go up to the Scale button, Right here it says values in reverse order, automatically flips over the axis. So I'm going to click OK. Since I've made this graph already today, it's already like that. Most of you, when you make this graph, the default for Excel will take it to 6,000. That creates a lot of visual clutter. Let me show you what that would look like. So your default on your graph is probably 6,000. And that creates like a big empty white space that doesn't show us any data. So I had gone in and changed the default. So let me show you how I'm doing that. Double click on the scale again. Click on scale. For maximum, I'm going to change this to 5,000. Click OK. And now we have it going to the depth that it's actually going to without a lot of empty space. I'm going to save that. And this should begin to look like some of the graphs you've already worked with. We don't need a title. I'll explain why when we start making graphs and research, but typically titles and descriptions go in a paper in a text box underneath. They're not part of the graph. Now you can see we have temperature up here and we have depth down the side. We're going to leave it like that for now, but we want to also put salinity in. Now we've so far drawn these all as separate, but one of the beauties of a graph is that you can represent more than one data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Chart, Source Data, and I want to add a series. So we have temperature versus depth already. Now we want salinity versus depth. So we'll put salinity as the name. I'm going to select salinity as my X value. Then, see how the default is 1? We don't want the default. We want our depth to be our Y. Be careful you don't select temperature. Make sure you select depth. Click OK. And now we have both graphs on the same scale on the same graph. And you can see in here, you can see the clients. There's the thermocline. And very small, you can see the halocline. This should probably remind you of the graph we made already. But I want to see the halocline clearly. And the reason why this is so sort of truncated, so to speak, is because we know salinity doesn't vary as much with depth as temperature does. So we're going to put it on its own scale. And when we first do this, it's going to look very strange. So just follow along for a minute and then watch. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Excel that I want a secondary axis. I do this by, and I sort of already did it, I double click on the series, salinity I'm working on, and I want it to plot it on a secondary axis. The default on Excel is always to make a secondary vertical. When you first see this, you're like, well, this is the silliest thing ever. Well, maybe you think that. So what I want to do is I want to tell it, first of all, I want it to know that I want a secondary horizontal axis. So I go up here to Chart Layout, not Axes Titles. I go to Axes. I need a secondary horizontal axis. And I don't need a secondary vertical axis. That's just visual clutter since it's going to be the same scale anyway. Oop. Edit undo. Let's try that again. Axes. Secondary vertical axis. I don't need an axis. What I do, before I do that, let me flip it over again. Double click on the scale. Go up to scale up here. Values in reverse order. Make sure you're on the same. So both sides are on 5,000. Sometimes the default goes back to 6. Now I turn off the secondary axis. Secondary vertical, no axis. What we've done now is we've created another axis here down at the bottom that's salinity. So the red is being plotted against that, while the blue is being plotted against the top, and they're both being plotted against depth. What you can see here is that the halocline lines up very nicely with the original thermocline. And then there's another little halocline right there. Now the purpose of graphs is to make data easy to see. And this is sort of a busy graph. So right off the bat, we're going to get rid of the legend. We want as much of the visual area available to be used in the graph itself, so we don't need a legend. If you ever do need a legend, by the way, the tip for a legend is we would usually just drag it inside here and then make the plot area bigger. If we had a graph that absolutely needed a legend, that way you still use all of your visual area for your image. But we don't need that. What we do need to do right off the bat is increase the font size. Notice it says chart area. So all those things we were working on, including the axes, can be selected here. I do want to work on the chart area. What I actually want to do on the chart area is change the font. 10 is sort of small, 16 is sort of the minimum. I'm going to make that size 16 font. I know it looks very large right now, but when you put these on in papers and whatnot, it'll make it easier to read. Additionally, we need axes titles. So if you go to chart layout, you need to label all your axes. A primary horizontal axis should have a title below. We're going to move this so you can actually read it. As you remember, this is temperature. Shift Option 8, Celsius. We're going to do that. Additionally, save often. We're going to do axes titles. Thank you. We're going to do an axes title below on the secondary horizontal. Again, same thing. We have to change the plot area a little bit. We're going to drag it up so it's easier to read. We're going to type right on top of this, salinity. Include our units. Same thing for the vertical. I'm going to do a rotated title. Again, have to edit my plot area. Remember, this is depth, and I put in my units. There are some traditional colors in graphing. Temperature is usually done in blue. Salinity, as you may remember, is typically done in green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my series. I'm going to go to line and change it to green. That's just typically done. Additionally, in order to give a hint to anybody who's reading which scale goes with which, I'm going to take this scale, go to font, change the color to the blue that goes with the graph. Click OK. Same thing with the axes title. I'm going to repeat that down here. I'm going to change the font to that bright green. Same thing with the title. And the last step of making a graph is we usually outline the plot area in a gray line. This is for printing purposes, not that you're going to print these out, but when you guys print your posters later on, if you put a gray line around images, it makes it so they're less likely to smear when they print. So this is the graph completed on its own. We have our temperature, our salinity. We've color-coded our axes so we know that the secondary axis goes with this. The green line goes with the green. The blue line goes with the blue. This is about as good as a graph can get, if I do say so myself. Please save with your last name and hold on to that. We're going to be going over bats a little bit in class, but it's basically the same.